Hello everyone. I am the storyteller, and I'm here to help you unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep. I know many of you use this video to help you relax, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing stories. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Feel free to share in the comments below. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and let's start this journey together. Take a deep breath, and relax. Story: The Signal. The sun had long since disappeared behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, leaving the desert to stretch out into a sea of shadows. The quiet was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant whisper of wind across the barren landscape. Nothing but dust and sand surrounded me in every direction. This was what I had been craving: solitude, peace, a break from the grind of modern life. The city had become too much for me. Too loud. Too crowded. And most of all, too suffocating. I needed space, and the Mojave Desert promised just that. I had been driving for hours, the road long and empty, when I finally found the perfect spot, a small ridge that overlooked a dry lakebed, surrounded by weathered rock outcrops. I pulled the RV off the dirt trail, the engine sputtering before falling silent. The air was thick with dust, and the temperature still carried the day's heat, despite the sinking sun. It was quiet here. Almost too quiet. I stepped out of the RV and stretched my legs, inhaling deeply. The air smelled of dust and sagebrush. There was something about the desert that fascinated me. The way it could be so harsh, yet strangely beautiful. The way it could be completely empty, but still so full of life. Hidden beneath the surface. The idea of getting lost in it, the freedom of that thought, was intoxicating. I set up camp quickly, pulled out my gear, and made a small fire in the pit I had dug earlier. The crackling of the flames was the only sound. Perfect. I needed to clear my head. The pressure of work, the constant rush of emails and phone calls, the endless expectations, they all felt like they were miles away. This was my escape, my sanctuary. A break from everything. But then, just as the last light of day faded, I heard it. A faint rhythmic sound, like a soft, pulsing beep. At first, I dismissed it as the creaking of the RV or perhaps the hum of some nearby electrical line. But when I stepped outside, the sound persisted. It was distant, just on the edge of hearing, but steady and regular. Like the ticking of a clock, only not quite right. I looked around, scanning the empty desert. The wind stirred the sand in small, shifting dunes, but there was nothing else. No sign of life. No other campers. Just me and the desert. I brushed it off. It was probably just some distant machinery, a far-off signal from somewhere I couldn't see. Maybe a car passing along a highway miles away. It didn't matter. I wasn't here to worry about strange sounds. Still, that night, the beeping returned. A low, persistent throb that seemed to resonate in my bones. I sat by the fire, watching the flames lick the air, trying to ignore it. But it was there. Constant. Unyielding. A pulse in the silence. By midnight, it had grown louder. I was no longer able to ignore it. The rhythmic beeping was no longer just an annoyance, it felt wrong, like it was somehow connected to something deeper. Something beneath the surface of the earth. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and started walking away from the campfire, my boots crunching on the dry earth. The beeping seemed to follow me, shifting with each step I took, always just beyond reach. just out of sight. My flashlight sliced through the dark, illuminating the barren landscape around me. I kept walking, the sound growing louder with every step, until the desert felt alive with the noise. I was almost running now, desperate to find its source, yet every time I thought I was getting closer, the sound would fade, only to return, even farther away. My pulse quickened. Sweat beaded on my forehead. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs began to feel like lead. I had no idea how far I had walked, but everything in me screamed that I needed to stop. The sound was getting too close. It was getting inside my head. I turned around, trying to make my way back to the RV, but the beeping followed me. Relentless, now accompanied by a new, high-pitched whine. The air felt thicker, as though the very atmosphere was pressing in on me. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter with every step I took, until I was surrounded by nothing but a crushing silence. And then, I saw it. A small, weathered building, half buried in sand. A shack. An old radio station or weather monitoring post, perhaps. The beeping was coming from inside. I stood frozen, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the rusted metal of the shack's entrance. My heart hammered in my chest as the high-pitched screech of the beeping grew louder, shaking my teeth. Something was wrong. This place wasn't just a relic. It was alive. Somehow. The signal, it wasn't just a signal. It was something else. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. But something inside me was drawn to the shack. The sound, the beeping, it was like it had a hold of my mind. It wanted me to come closer. To discover what was inside. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The door creaked open with a groan as I pushed it. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. My flashlight beam bounced off old, broken equipment, wires strewn across the floor. Faded maps on the walls. There was a feeling of abandonment, of decay, but also of something more. Something pressing. In the center of the room, a large radio tower stood, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the metal walls. They spiraled outward, almost as if feeding into the tower itself. The beeping was louder now, pounding in my head. It was so loud it felt like my brain was about to explode. I stumbled forward, my mind a blur, and noticed a journal lying on the floor. The pages were yellowed, brittle, covered in frantic scribbles. I flipped through it, my heart sinking as I read the words. The entries were short, scrawled in a wild hand, describing the signal, the beeping, how it started soft, then grew louder. And how it never stopped. It gets inside your head, one entry read. It controls you. It feeds on your thoughts. It never lets go. I dropped the journal as the beeping changed. It became sharper, more insistent, almost a shriek, reverberating through the metal walls of the shack. I staggered back, clutching my ears, but it didn't help. The noise was everywhere. And then, I understood. The signal wasn't just noise. It was alive. It was a consciousness. And it was trying to take me. I turned and ran, the world around me spinning, my head pounding with the relentless beeping. The desert landscape felt wrong, as though the earth itself was shifting, moving with the sound. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs carried me forward, but the desert was endless, the darkness closing in on all sides. I didn't stop until I reached the RV. I threw open the door and collapsed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The beeping hadn't stopped, but it was softer now, more distant. My mind was buzzing with it, the pulse still reverberating in my skull. I locked the doors and crawled into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Not with the sound still there, lingering in the back of my mind. The next morning, I packed up quickly, leaving the desert behind. The beeping was still there, faint but persistent, just below the surface of my thoughts. I didn't look back as I drove away. I couldn't. But even now, days later, back in the city, I still hear it. The rhythmic pulse. The signal. It's always there, in the background, calling to me, pulling me back to the desert. And I know, deep down, that I will never truly escape. Days passed after I left the desert. The city felt louder than before. I had grown so accustomed to the silence of the Mojave that the constant hum of traffic, the endless buzz of streetlights, the murmur of conversations all felt like a cacophony in my head. But no matter how many people surrounded me, no matter how many distractions I immersed myself in, the signal was always there. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation of the desert playing tricks on my mind. A result of too many hours in the heat, too many days alone. The noise, the beeping, it must have been a hallucination. But even as I told myself this, I could feel it, faint but relentless, at the edge of my consciousness. That rhythmic pulse. It hadn't gone away. I found myself unable to focus at work. My coworkers would talk to me, but it felt as if they were speaking through a fog. I could hear the words, but they didn't make sense. All I could think about was the sound. The beeping. It was like it had become a part of me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. Every time I tried to relax, it pulsed in my brain, steady and unyielding. I began to avoid my usual routine. Meetings, phone calls, even meals became a blur. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the beeping echoing through the dark. It was so loud it felt like it was inside my skull, vibrating my bones. I had to do something. I couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, when the noise had become unbearable, I grabbed my keys and left the apartment. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away. I drove, aimlessly, without direction, hoping that if I just kept moving, the sound would fade. It didn't. The further I drove, the more the signal seemed to intensify. It was as if the roads themselves were leading me back, drawing me to something that I couldn't avoid. I found myself heading back toward the Mojave, but this time, I wasn't even sure why. Was it the need for closure? Or was I being drawn back to the source? The question gnawed at me, but I didn't have the strength to stop. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, my mind a whirlpool of frantic thoughts. As I neared the desert once again, something changed. The beeping wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. I could hear it outside the car, faint but undeniable, pulsing through the air. I rolled down the window, the hot wind rushing in, and listened. It was louder now. Clearer. The sound was coming from somewhere nearby. I pulled off the highway, my car kicking up dust as I parked on the shoulder. I got out, eyes scanning the empty landscape. The desert was still and vast, stretching out in every direction. But the sound, the beeping, was so clear now that it was impossible to ignore. It was everywhere. I followed it. The silence that had once been so peaceful was now oppressive. The beeping grew louder. More insistent, like it was calling me, drawing me closer. The landscape around me began to shift. What had once been a place of beauty and serenity now seemed alien, strange, even hostile. The desert wasn't just empty. It was alive with a presence that I couldn't comprehend. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The sun was beginning to set again, casting long shadows across the land, but the beeping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder the farther I went, as though it was marking my every step, tracing my movements through the sand. And then, I saw it. The old shack. The same one. My heart pounded in my chest. I had promised myself that I would never return here. But here I was, standing at its rusted door, the beeping louder now than it had ever been before. It was coming from inside. I could feel it, like a pulse reverberating through the air. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to turn around. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. But my legs didn't listen. I pushed open the door, and the sound surged, a wave of static and beeping filling my ears. The air inside the shack was thick with dust, just as I remembered it, but now the atmosphere felt different. Heavier. More oppressive. Like the air itself was charged with something unnatural. I stepped inside, flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam dancing across the walls. The same symbols were there, etched into the metal, spiraling inward like something feeding the tower in the center. But now, they seemed different. More pronounced. Almost alive, as if they were shifting, changing beneath my gaze. The beeping didn't stop. It echoed through the walls, vibrating in my chest, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. I approached the radio tower, the same one I had seen before. But now, it was buzzing. Humming with an energy that made my skin crawl. I could feel the static in the air. My fingers twitched. I didn't know what I expected to find, maybe answers, maybe just an explanation, but what I found was worse than I could have imagined. At the base of the tower, there was a small console, its screen flickering, faint symbols dancing across it in an unfamiliar language. The beeping wasn't random. It was a code. A pattern. A message. And then, I saw it. A journal. The same one I had read before, but now, there were new entries. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was more frantic. Desperate. As though whoever had written it had been driven to madness by the very thing I was hearing. It's not just a signal. It's a force. It moves through the land, through the air, through the bones of the earth. It calls. It pulls. Once it finds you, it doesn't let go. The beeping, it's not random. It's a warning. A signal of something waiting. I tried to run. I tried to escape, but it followed me. It always follows. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking. The beeping was deafening now. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The walls around me seemed to close in. It wasn't just the signal anymore. Something else was in the air. Something ancient, something that had been here long before I arrived. And then, the lights flickered. The beeping stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if he had been wandering the desert for years without food or water. His clothes were torn and caked with dust, his skin burnt from the sun. He stared at me with an expression of cold emptiness. "You're too late," he whispered, his voice like dry sand scraping against stone. "It's already inside you." Before I could speak, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The air hummed with a low frequency, vibrating through the walls of the shack. The beeping started again, louder, faster, more insistent, as if the entire desert was alive with it, all of it converging on this one point. The tower, the signal, the man, they were all part of something bigger. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for centuries. And now it had me. The desert around me was no longer still. The air vibrated, hummed with a life of its own. It was suffocating, oppressive. The beeping, the signal, had become something more. Something bigger than just noise. It had become a presence. The figure in the doorway, gaunt and hollow, had been right. I had been too late. The man's words echoed in my mind, "It's already inside you." I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. My head felt like it was splitting open, and the beeping, louder, faster, shriller, was inside my skull, rattling my thoughts. I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen. Trapped in the grip of something I couldn't understand, something I had no control over. I turned away from the man. I had to escape. I had to get out. But as I stumbled toward the door, something stopped me. My flashlight, still in my trembling hand, cast a strange shadow across the room. The walls weren't just covered in symbols anymore, they were shifting. The carvings, once still, now seemed to twist and writhe. The patterns weren't just etched into the metal, they were alive, moving, pulsing, feeding into the radio tower at the center of the room. I looked back at the man, and he was gone. Vanished. But I could still hear him, his voice. Faint but clear in my mind, "It's already inside you." I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know what I had done to deserve this, but as I turned and stumbled out of the shack, I realized something horrifying. The beeping hadn't stopped. It wasn't just a sound. It was part of the land. Part of the air. Part of me now. As I walked away from the shack, the desert seemed to close in on me. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the horizon bending in unnatural ways. I was no longer in control of my own steps. I was walking, but I wasn't choosing to walk. The signal was pulling me, guiding me, making me follow it, making me part of it. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but I kept moving, my legs burning, my chest aching for breath. The beeping became a relentless pulse, vibrating through my body. My head pounded with every step. It was everywhere. It was inside me. By the time I reached the RV, the night had fallen. The desert was still, too still. The wind had stopped. The fire I had left burning in the pit was nothing but a dying glow. The world around me was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic pulse that continued to throb in my skull. But it wasn't just in my head. It was in the air. It was in the very land I stood on. I collapsed in the driver's seat of the RV, my fingers fumbling for the keys. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I could outrun this thing, this signal that had taken hold of me. I had to leave. I had to get away. I started the engine, the roar of the RV's motor breaking the silence, but the sound of the engine was drowned out by the beeping. It was deafening now, like it was coming from the very core of the earth. I pressed the gas pedal, desperate to drive away from it, but the sound only grew louder, closer, pulling me towards something I couldn't see, but could feel deep in my bones. I drove for hours. Days, maybe. The landscape around me was a blur, nothing but sand, rock, and the endless horizon. But no matter how far I went, the signal followed. It was always there, pulsing in the background, louder than the engine, louder than the road beneath. The tires. And then, I saw it. A black dot in the distance, growing larger with every mile. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to get closer. But my hands were no longer my own. The RV slowed, as if it had a mind of its own, pulling me toward the source of the signal. I fought it, gripped the steering wheel, but it was futile. The RV came to a halt in front of a structure, something I didn't recognize. It wasn't a shack this time. No. This was something else. Something far more sinister. A massive metal tower, its base surrounded by the twisted remnants of machinery and equipment. It was tall, imposing, almost alive with the beeping. The pulse of the signal came from it, radiating out in waves that seemed to distort the very air around it. I got out of the RV, my legs unsteady as I stumbled toward the tower. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The beeping was unbearable now, inside my mind, in my bones. At the base of the tower, I saw something that made my stomach turn, a series of bodies. Scattered around the ground, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They were the ones who had come before me. The ones who had heard the signal and followed it to this place. I realized then, too late, that I wasn't meant to escape. The signal didn't want me to run. It didn't want me to fight. It didn't want anything from me. Except for my presence. It fed on fear, on isolation, on the human mind. It made people follow it, made them come to it, until they were lost, swallowed whole by the desert and whatever ancient force lived within it. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the roar of the beeping. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the signal grew louder, tearing at my sanity. My vision blurred, my mind twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The pulse wasn't just in my head anymore, it was everywhere. It was the desert. It was the earth. It was me. I was already part of it. And then, everything went silent. The following morning, the desert was still. The RV was abandoned, parked in the same spot. It had been the night before, but there was no sign of the man who had once driven it. The sand around the tower was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. The beeping was gone. For now. But somewhere, deep in the Mojave Desert, a new signal pulses through the earth, waiting. Calling. It will not stop. It will not rest. And one day, someone else will hear it. And they will follow. Story: The Whispering Pines. Evan had always sought solitude. After his service in the military, the constant noise of civilian life had become unbearable. He needed quiet. He needed peace. So, when he found the old, overgrown trail leading into the wilderness, it felt like a sign. It was the kind of place that promised isolation, far away from the bustling city and the distractions of daily life. He rented an RV for the trip. A perfect way to go off-grid, stay self-sufficient, and explore the wilds of the Whispering Pines forest. No cell service, no internet, just the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. After hours of winding roads and narrow trails, Evan found his spot, near a small, hidden lake nestled between towering pines. The trees stretched upward, their dark green needles creating a canopy that blocked out most of the overcast sky. It was quiet here, unnervingly quiet, but that was exactly what he wanted. He parked the RV by the edge of the lake and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. No human sounds, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the soft ripple of water lapping at the shore. It felt like peace, like he could finally breathe. Evan unpacked his gear, setting up camp as he had done countless times before. He knew the routine: gather firewood, start a small fire, and make sure everything was secure. It didn't take long. He was a man of habit, and the familiar motions grounded him, made him feel at ease. As he walked through the forest to gather more wood, something caught his eye: strange marks carved into the bark of a nearby pine tree. The figure was crude, elongated, and thin, almost skeletal. Evan frowned as he ran his fingers over the carvings. It was too high up for a normal person to reach, but maybe some bored hikers had carved it. Then he found another one. And another. Each marking was similar: tall, thin figures etched into the trees, their limbs stretching impossibly high. It was odd, but Evan didn't think too much of it. People did strange things in the woods, and it was probably just a local prank. He continued collecting wood, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up his spine. By the time night fell, the campfire was crackling softly, its light flickering across the clearing. Evan sat by the fire, staring into the growing darkness. The silence was deeper here than he expected. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling in the leaves, no chirping insects. Just nothing. He shrugged it off. It was a quiet place, and maybe the forest was just still tonight. But as the night wore on, the silence became unsettling. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway gently, but there was no other sound. No crickets, no owls. Just the fire crackling and the occasional rustle of the branches above. Evan sat up, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He thought he heard something, just beyond the light of the fire. A soft rustling, almost like something was moving in the brush. He turned his flashlight toward the noise, but when the beam cut through the darkness, there was nothing there. "You're just on edge," he muttered to himself. "Get a grip, Evan." He sat back down, trying to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. But the longer he sat there, the more it felt like the forest itself was waiting. Waiting for something. Or someone. Then, just as he was about to shake it off, he saw it, a shadow flitting at the edge of his vision. Tall. Thin. Like one of the carvings on the trees. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, flashlight in hand, and aimed it toward the shape. But when the beam hit the trees, there was nothing. Only shadows. Only the dark. He was starting to doubt himself. Maybe he was just imagining things, after all. But then, the rustling started again. This time, louder. Closer. Evan's pulse quickened. Something was out there. The next morning, Evan decided to go deeper into the woods. He needed to clear his head. Get some distance from the campsite. Maybe he was just tired, maybe it was the isolation starting to get to him. He needed to shake off the unease. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the dense trees. As he walked, he found more of the strange carvings. This time, there were even more of them, slender, elongated figures staring out from the trees, their faceless heads turned toward him. It was like they were watching him. The air felt heavier here, the canopy so thick that only dappled sunlight filtered through. Every step Evan took seemed to make the forest darker, the trees closer. It felt wrong. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. About an hour into his hike, he reached a ridge that overlooked the valley. The view was stunning, endless trees stretching out below, mountains rising in the distance. It should have been peaceful. But all Evan could think about was the strange feeling in his gut. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. He turned, startled, and saw an old man standing a few feet away. The man was holding a bundle of firewood, his face weathered by years spent outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," Evan said, trying to mask his surprise. "Not many people come this deep into the forest." The man gave a small, tired smile. "You should be careful. This part of the forest, it's different." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" The old man glanced nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. Something they call the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You'll see it once, and then you'll start seeing it everywhere." Evan chuckled, thinking it was some local ghost story. But the old man didn't smile. His face grew serious, his eyes narrowing with an intensity that made Evan's unease grow. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see it, they don't come back the same." Evan didn't know whether to laugh or be concerned. But something about the way the man looked at him made Evan think that maybe he wasn't joking. "Just be careful," the man said. "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first. And then you'll feel it." With that, the man turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving Evan with a gnawing feeling in his chest. That evening, as the sun set and darkness crept across the forest, Evan found himself sitting by the campfire, unable to shake the old man's warning from his mind. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and dance, casting long, shifting shadows across the clearing. And then, the rustling started again. But this time, it was different. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was circling the campsite. Evan grabbed his flashlight, his hand shaking as he aimed it into the dark. The beam barely cut through the trees. The footsteps stopped. Evan's heart pounded in his chest. He turned in a slow circle, flashlight in one hand and his knife in the other, his mind racing. There was something out there. He could feel it. And then, just beyond the firelight, he saw it. A figure. Tall. Thin. Skeletal. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its head tilted forward as though watching him from above. The eyes, or where the eyes should have been, were just dark pits, empty and hollow, staring directly at him. Evan's blood ran cold. He backed up slowly, raising the knife, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Who are you?" Evan called out, his voice trembling despite himself. No answer. The figure remained still, its dark, empty gaze fixed on him. Without thinking, Evan bolted toward the RV. He didn't dare look back. He slammed the door shut behind him, heart racing. For hours, he sat by the window, knife in hand, watching the figure through the glass. It never moved. It just stood there, staring into the RV. When the sun finally began to rise, the figure was gone. But the carvings had multiplied. Dozens of the same tall, thin figures now covered the trees surrounding his campsite. Evan didn't waste any time. He packed up quickly, throwing his things into the RV and starting the engine. He didn't look back as he drove down the narrow trail, the strange carvings watching him all the way. As Evan drove away, leaving the whispering pines behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that The Watcher was still out there. Watching. Even as the trees began to thin, even as the road stretched out ahead of him, the gnawing sense that he wasn't alone followed him. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest had receded, but he swore, for just a moment, that he saw one last figure, tall, thin, and watching. The Watcher would always be out there. And Evan would never forget that feeling, the feeling of being watched by something beyond understanding, something that would never let him go. Evan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had marked him. Even though the whispering pines faded in his rearview mirror, the haunting presence of the Watcher lingered in his mind. Like a dark cloud. He'd left the RV behind at a remote campsite miles from where he had seen the creature, and now he found himself driving aimlessly. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white with tension. It was late afternoon, and the sky had begun to cloud over. He glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard, 5:32 p.m., but it felt like time itself was stretching, warping, pulling him back toward the forest. The thought that it was all in his head crept in now and then, but he couldn't convince himself. No matter how much logic he tried to apply to the situation, something inside him refused to let go of the truth he had glimpsed in the dark. Something sinister, something ancient, had watched him, and it wasn't done yet. He needed to get away. He needed peace. But peace had a way of evading him. Evan turned off the highway and onto a winding, dirt road that led to a small town. He'd been on the road for hours, and the idea of stopping for the night seemed like a good one. He found a small, run-down inn on the outskirts of town, nestled on the edge of a different forest. The innkeeper, an older woman with graying hair and tired eyes, greeted him with a blank stare. When he asked if there were any hiking trails nearby, she stiffened slightly. Her gaze dropped to the counter, then slowly raised again. "There's one," she said in a low voice, "but I'd be careful if I were you." Evan frowned. "Why's that?" The woman's fingers drummed against the counter. "People, they go into those woods. Some of them don't come back." It wasn't unusual for small towns to have their ghost stories or whispered warnings, but Evan could tell this wasn't just talk. The woman seemed unsettled. Her words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken fear. Evan nodded politely, took his key, and headed to his room. That night, the old inn creaked and groaned with the wind, but Evan barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Watcher, its hollow eyes, its lanky, unnatural figure just standing there, waiting. He was back in the whispering pines. It was different this time. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. The trees loomed over him like silent sentinels, and the silence was deafening. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves. The forest had swallowed all sound. And then, there was a voice. It wasn't one he could hear clearly, but it was there, deep and resonant, echoing within his chest rather than his ears. The voice called his name, soft, almost pleading. Evan. His feet moved against his will, the sound of his own breathing too loud in his ears as he walked through the dense, darkened forest. The carvings on the trees were back, dozens of them, each figure taller than before, the limbs stretching impossibly high, the faces, if you could call them faces, twisted into hollow voids. The path wound deeper, and then, ahead of him, he saw it. A figure. Not the Watcher this time, but something else. Its body was tall and fluid, made of smoke and shadow, flickering in and out of existence. Its eyes, or again, where eyes should have been, glowed with an eerie, pulsing light, like the flicker of dying stars. "Why are you here?" the figure asked, its voice both alien and familiar, a strange blend of the forest and something older. I don't know, Evan whispered, taking a hesitant step backward. I was just trying to get away. To be alone. The figure's shadowy form flickered again, and then it was gone, replaced by the faint, distant sound of footsteps. Deliberate, slow, and closing in. He recognized them. Immediately, the same haunting footsteps from the previous night. It was the Watcher. It had found him again. Evan's heart pounded as he turned to run, but the world around him shifted. The forest closed in. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches twisting into shapes that weren't natural. Forming grotesque, claw-like hands that reached toward him. Not alone, a voice echoed. You'll never be alone again. Evan woke with a start, drenched in sweat. His room in the inn was dark, the clock showing 3:47 a.m. His breath was shallow, and his heart raced as though he had just run a marathon. The room seemed to close in around him, and he felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get away from this place. But he knew better than to run. He couldn't escape what had been marked on him. The Watcher, whatever it was, wasn't just in the forest. It was inside his head now. Inside his soul. He couldn't stop thinking about the voice in his dream, the figure made of smoke. Was it a warning? A promise? He didn't know, but there was one thing he was sure of, he needed to go back. Back to the Whispering Pines. Only then could he confront whatever it was that was following him. Evan rented a vehicle and made his way back to the same highway that had led him to the Whispering Pines the first time. The trees that lined the road seemed to beckon him, there. Dark shapes like sentinels waiting. It was as if the forest itself knew he would return. The moment he entered the area around the Whispering Pines again, the unease that had been gnawing at him for days intensified. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. The sun was barely visible behind thick clouds, casting everything in a dull, gray light. He parked on the side of the narrow road, the gravel crunching beneath his tires, and took a deep breath. The forest stood before him, vast and intimidating. The same path he had driven down weeks ago, when everything had started, seemed to call to him, like an old friend, or an enemy waiting to strike. Evan stood in front of the forest, the stillness of the air pressing down on him. He felt the weight of something ancient surrounding him, something older than the trees themselves. And then, as if on cue, the wind shifted, and the trees whispered. Evan followed the narrow trail deeper into the woods, heart pounding in his chest. Each step felt like it was taking him further from the world he knew, closer to the world he had unknowingly entered. The carvings on the trees were there, as before, strange, elongated figures, their hollow eyes staring down at him. But now, something else had changed. The figures were no longer static. They seemed to move, subtly, as if they were alive. He heard the footsteps again. Slow. Deliberate. And then, just ahead, he saw it, a figure standing between the trees. Tall. Thin. And at its side, another. And another. The Watcher had brought friends. They were all around him now, silent, like statues, watching him from every direction. Their limbs stretched unnaturally long, their faces hollow voids. The air was suffocating. The forest had become a maze, and he was trapped inside it. The voice from his dream echoed again, low and rumbling. Welcome back, Evan. He spun around, his pulse racing, trying to find the source. The Watcher stepped forward. From the shadows, its skeletal form towering over him. You were chosen, the Watcher said, its voice deep and cold. The forest called to you. The carvings on the trees, they mark you as one of us now. You will never be free. We have been waiting. Evan staggered back, fear and disbelief battling for control. No. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to be left alone. The Watcher tilted its head, and for the first time, its hollow eyes seemed to burn with a strange intensity. You were always meant to come here. The Watcher does not choose. It only waits. Before Evan could react, the air around him seemed to thicken. The figures moved, their limbs stretching toward him. The forest, the trees, the earth itself seemed to reach for him. He was not alone. He never would be again. The Watcher stepped closer, its cold presence filling his every thought. And then, as the forest closed in, he understood. There was no escape. The whispering pines had claimed him. Evan's breath came in shallow gasps as the Watcher loomed over him. Its hollow eyes, like black holes, seemed to pull at his very soul, drawing him closer to the ancient force that had marked him. His heart hammered in his chest, his legs shaky, but his feet refused to move. The figures surrounding him, tall, thin, skeletal, advanced slowly, their long limbs stretching with unnatural grace. They didn't walk. They glided. Every step felt like a beat-in. The pulse of the forest itself, a rhythm that echoed in Evan's bones, a reminder that he was no longer part of the outside world. He had entered something much darker. The Watcher spoke again, its voice rasping through the stillness of the forest like wind through dead leaves. You came seeking peace, but peace was never meant for you. The forest calls to those who have seen the unseeable, those who have glimpsed the edges of the dark. Evan shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. No. I don't want this. I just wanted to get away, to be left alone. A cold, dry laugh echoed in the air, like the sound of bones cracking. The Watcher tilted its head, its skeletal body casting a long, unnatural shadow across the ground. You were never truly alone, Evan. Not in the way you thought. The forest watches. Always. It sees everything. The trees groaned as if agreeing, their branches creaking like ancient doors opening, closing. Evan took a step back, trying to distance himself from the looming figures, but every direction he turned revealed more of them, each one taller, thinner, more terrifying than the last. They circled him now, their faces mere voids where eyes should be, as if the forest itself had erased any trace of humanity from them. No, Evan whispered, his hands trembling. I can't stay here. You cannot leave, the Watcher said, its voice now carrying the weight of finality. You are bound to the forest, just as we are. The carvings on the trees, they are not just markings. They are bindings. Warnings. Those who see the Watcher are chosen to join the forests. Watch, whether they want to or not. Evan's mind reeled. The carvings. The figures. The footsteps that followed him. All of it had been leading him here, to this moment. To this inevitable fate. He turned desperately, trying to outrun the grip the forest had on him. But no matter which way he looked, he saw only the same endless sea of towering trees and dark figures. The air was thick, suffocating. He couldn't breathe. And then he felt it. A pull. A tug at his chest. The air around him seemed to warp and distort, as if the very space itself were stretching toward him, consuming him. He stumbled back, his mind clouded with the weight of his situation, but then he remembered, his knife. Without thinking, he reached for the hilt, pulling it from its sheath with a shaky hand. The cold steel felt solid in his grip, but it was little more than a symbol of resistance now. He swung it wildly, slashing at the nearest figure, but the blade passed right through it, like cutting through mist. The watcher tilted its head, an eerie smile forming in the place where a face should have been. "There is no escape," it said softly. "You were chosen long before you arrived. And now, you will join us. You will watch." Evan's pulse raced as the world around him grew darker. The trees seemed to press in on him, the figures drawing closer, until he was surrounded by them, by the watchers. With every breath, the forest seemed to close in further, the air growing heavier. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. And then, as the watcher reached out toward him, something inside Evan snapped. Suddenly, everything stopped. The forest went still. The watchers froze. The trees, once creaking and groaning in the oppressive silence, stood perfectly motionless. Evan's chest tightened, and he realized he could hear his own heartbeat, thumping loudly in the eerie quiet. "Get out of my head," he said, his voice raw, breaking through the silence. His eyes darted around, his mind scrambling to make sense of the stillness that surrounded him. For the first time since entering the Whispering Pines, Evan felt a surge of clarity. A memory flashed through his mind, something he had forgotten in his panic. The old man in the woods, the one he had met earlier, he had warned him. "You'll know when it's close," the old man had said. "You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." Evan had felt it all along, the watcher's presence, drawing him deeper into the forest, binding him to this place. But there was more to it. He wasn't just being hunted by the watcher. He was being tested. He looked around once more, and this time, the figures, no longer moving, no longer advancing, appeared almost still. Frozen. The watcher had said there was no escape, but Evan knew now what he had to do. There was something about this forest, something ancient and old, more ancient than the watcher itself. It wasn't the watcher that held him captive. It was the forest. And he could feel its grip loosening. Without thinking, Evan raised his knife one final time, not toward the watcher, but toward the tree in front of him, the very tree where the first carving had appeared. The blade sank into the bark with a loud, satisfying crack. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the earth trembled. The sky darkened, and the wind kicked up, swirling around Evan. The figures surrounding him flickered, their bodies wavering like smoke in the breeze. The trees groaned, their limbs shaking as though they were awakening from a deep slumber. The watcher let out a low, guttural sound. "No. You cannot." But it was too late. The forest recoiled, the trees pulling back, the watchers disintegrating into wisps of shadow. Evan stood, panting, the weight of the curse lifting from his shoulders as the forest around him seemed to dissolve. The carvings on the trees, the strange, elongated figures, faded into nothingness, their once sharp outlines blurring as if they were never truly there. The air lightened, and Evan's breath returned to him. The forest, now devoid of the dark presence, stood silent. Peaceful. It was over. But Evan knew, deep down, that the Whispering Pines had not forgotten him. He had broken free, at least for now. The watcher had retreated, but it would always be there, in the shadows of the forest, waiting. Watching. Evan turned and walked back toward the road. His body ached, his mind weary from the struggle, but he had survived. He had faced the darkness of the Whispering Pines and won, for now. But he knew, in the back of his mind, that the forest would always call to him, its whispers lingering in his ears. The Watcher would always be there, watching. And though Evan had escaped, he could never truly leave.
Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.